Hi guys, welcome to lesson 4 of our ecosystems topic. Today we're going to be looking at biodiversity and adaptation in ecosystems. Now they're two words that you might have heard before, you might have heard them in science. We're going to really go into some depth today looking at what they mean and how they apply to what we have been studying thus far in the topic. So, to recap the entire term so far, we've started looking at something called an ecosystem. And in the last two lessons, you were looking at something called a biome, and you were looking at the climate of different biomes. Now, the biomes themselves were those areas that had a distinctly similar climate, soil, and biodiversity or types of plants and animals. So, for example, if you went to any area of the rainforest on this map, you would see a similar climate, similar soil, and similar species of plants and animals. A quick pause. The tundra is this red area here, this red biome here. If you pause the video and have a think, would you feel confident explaining to me what the climate of the tundra is like? And remember, in geography, when we are talking about climate, we are referring to two things: temperature and precipitation. So, what is the climate of the tundra? Pause the video, then unpause it when you think you've got an answer. Okay, so the tundra, in terms of temperature, is very cold, and it's coldest in the winter months where it goes to up to -25. The tundra also has low precipitation, and bonus points if you remember from the last lesson, but the tundra can also be called something called a cold desert. It's called a cold desert not because all deserts are warm, because a desert refers to an area with very low precipitation. The tundra is one such area. So we're going to look at two words today, and they're both tier 3 vocabulary words, and they are biodiversity and adaptation. Now, these two words are kind of words that you might have seen before, but we need to know exactly what they mean. So we're going to go through each of them now, then we're going to do some examples as well. So, the key term here is biodiversity. If you break the word down, bio, from biology meaning living things, and diversity meaning the number of different things, biodiversity means the variety of plant and animal life in the world or particular habitat. A high level is usually important or desirable. So, for example, I'm currently recording this in my classroom in school. My classroom has an incredibly low biodiversity. As I look out from my classroom, I look over a small area of grass with a couple of trees and maybe some species of insect and bird living there. That biodiversity is higher than my classroom because there is a greater variety of plant and animal life. Biodiversity can be very, very high. So, for example, a coral reef ecosystem, which is not a biome but it is an ecosystem in the ocean, has an incredibly high biodiversity. So, if I went scuba diving in the coral reef, I would see a huge variety of different types of plants, of different types of animals. And that's what it essentially means. It's not the number of them. So, for example, if my forest had 1,000 tigers in it, and that's it, the biodiversity is still very, very low. There's only one variety of animal and plant life. Whereas, if my forest had one tiger, a lion, an antelope, and a gazelle, even though there are less animals there, the biodiversity is higher. So, I'll have a little pause. Based on that, is biodiversity high or low in the desert biome? Okay, biodiversity in the desert biome is definitely very, very low. If you look on the picture, there is some examples of life, like these little tree stumps here. Maybe we might have insects in the sand as well. But overall, the variety of different plant and animal species is very, very low. And if we need to make the connection here is, well, why is the biodiversity so low in the desert. And it all relates to the last lesson we did on biome climates. So we looked at this climate graph and it said that the hot desert climate was hot all year round, especially in them summer months. But most importantly, we're looking at the precipitation rates down here. In order to sustain life on this planet, water, precipitation, is essential. If we don't have water, we cannot survive. A human can last about 30 days without water. We can last for a month without food. It's absolutely vital. And because it is a desert, there is very, very, very low amounts of precipitation. And therefore, very few plants are going to be able to grow. If few plants are going to grow, that means there are few animals being able to eat those plants. And therefore, there are less animals and plants able to live or even breed in that ecosystem. So that's because the best conditions for life are when it is warm and when it is wet. We like warmth because if you know in science, if I put my plant in the freezer, it would die. If I put it in the fridge, it might struggle as well. When you go outside in winter, and you go to a park, you don't see many flowers in winter because they would die when they spawn. When it's warmer in spring and summer, we start to see trees flower, we start to see flowers go up in the parks, on the roads, etc. And that's because when it's warmer, it's better for life. When you have little eggs, for example, when a chicken's eggs, if you've ever seen it on a farm, they put the eggs under an incubator, a hot light to keep it warm, because if things get too cold, it's not ideal, and equally, it needs to be wet as well. If the climate is too dry, it doesn't matter how hot it is, you are not going to survive. And if it is warm and wet, it enables growth of vegetation and it provides a food source to sustain that ecosystem. So this is a food web for the Mojave Desert. And essentially, if you look on the bottom there, even though the biodiversity looks quite high, that is very, very low because there are only 4 things at the bottom, the Joshua tree, the grass, the seeds and the cacti, that can sustain the rest of this wildlife. If we were in a hot and wet place, there would be much more of these and our food web would be much, much more diverse. So, based on that, which biome do you think would have the highest biodiversity? Pause the video, have a think, and then unpause it when you think you know the answer. Okay, the biome with the highest biodiversity would definitely be the tropical rainforest because the climate is hot and wet. So, if we know that they need warm and wet conditions for growth, then how do plants and animals actually live in harsh conditions? Because in the tundra here, even though it's freezing and we know it's a desert, there is still plant life on here. And the answer is something called adaptation. Now, an adaptation is where an animal has changed its appearance or changed what it looks like to live in a specific area. Full disclaimer here, one of my favourite geography videos is on adaptation. If you want to Google it now, you can pause the video and have my permission to do that. Type into YouTube, adaptation camel song. You are welcome. You will not get it out of your head for weeks. It is a very good song. So camel adaptation song, type that into YouTube and then come back to this and we'll get going. So, like I said, an animal is changing its appearance. And the most famous one, hopefully you've had a look at that little song, hopefully you've seen a camel. Now, when we think about a camel, we always know it has this big hump. First key fact here, it is not water in the hump, it is filled with fat. So a camel, over time, from evolution, has adapted to live in the desert. It has long eyelashes to keep out the sand when there's sandstorms. It has long legs to help it cool down faster. It has wide feet to increase the surface area so it can walk on the hot sand without getting burnt. And it also has a fat-filled hump, and that happens when there are areas where there's no water or no food. They can use that as like a get-out-of-jail-free card to keep them sustained in the months or the weeks when there is no water or no food. And that has enabled a camel to survive in the desert. But adaptations are in every single biome. So for example, this is a polar bear. They have thick white fur to help them camouflage. So that means that it's hard for their prey to see them coming, and it's there to keep them warm as well. Polar bears have a huge layer of fat under their skin, helping them stay warm. And they can actually go for huge periods of time without water. So over time, polar bears have adapted and changed to enable them to survive in this climate. If we're thinking about the theory of evolution, what Darwin would suggest is that the polar bears that didn't adapt would die and not breed. The ones that did do these changes would survive and pass on the changes down a generation. So all these things enable these animals to survive in that area. Now, we're going to look at a different type of adaptation. We're going to look at a very extreme one in a place called the Andes Mountain, which is a huge mountain range in South America. They are very, very, very high up, so the altitude is very, very high, and the temperature is very, very cold. Sometimes it can be minus 20. Plants grow behind boulders to shelter from the wind. Some of them, actually, the plants involve something called lichen, which grows on the rock and breaks it up. So they kind of produce this bacterial type thing that breaks down rocks and so that enables the plant to use it. So because there's no soil, because of how high up it is, the plant uses that lichen to kind of make its own soil. They have very long roots that anchor themselves in the soil. It can get very, very windy, as it says up here. And in terms of animals, they're very thick fur for warmth. The chinchilla is quite round in shape to lose as little heat as possible. And the puma, it is larger and it has a bigger volume, which means less heat is lost. I want you to pause this video and I want you to read through this paragraph. It'll take you about a minute and a half and then it'll help you with the next set of questions. So pause the video and can you read this little paragraph to yourself? Okay, hopefully you've had a read. So, based on that, we're looking at 3 adaptations. So growing behind boulders, long roots, lichen, pumas, vicuna, and chinchillas. I want you to jot down why these adaptations are needed. If you're not sure, the answers are all in this part of the video, so you can pause it on this slide or you can go back to it by rewinding the video. So give you 5 minutes, pause the video, have a go at filling in that table for me, please. It can be rough work, doesn't matter. Okay, so the first one then, growing behind boulders, that was to make sure it could shelter from the wind, very strong winds. The long roots were to anchor it in place, again from the wind. And the lichen used the nutrients in rocks. They need that because they need to turn it into soil because there is very little soil in that mountain area. Chinchillas are round to reduce the amount of heat they lose. Vicuna have thick fur as insulation so they can store the heat because it's very, very cold in that mountain region. And the pumas are bigger than normal because they have that larger surface area. Because a bigger volume means less heat is lost, basically. So hopefully you got all them. That's good. So to finish off the lesson again, guys, there's some review questions. As usual, I want you to answer these questions, upload and share my homeworks. The questions are, what is biodiversity? Why is biodiversity low in the desert and high in the rainforest? And explain 2 ways plants and animals have adapted to the Andes mountain biome. I have spoken or told you all the answers to these questions, so if you're unsure in the first instance, please rewind this video and go back to where I talk about these topics. If you're still struggling, as always, please go on the Zoom call and ask for additional support.